Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 46 of Pocket Edition. I'm your host, Sully, and today we are joined by the number one show regular in Mark. How are you today, Mark?
I'm good. I feel like my title changes every episode.
I try to mix it up a little bit.
Yeah. Confusing even me.
That's it. I mean, in reality, we are both the Pocket Edition hosts, so that's probably a fairer representation of you on the show. I apologise, Mark.
It's just Team Australia because the timing works well.
Second in order, but definitely not second in status, I guess, host-wise, Mark. How's that sound?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Whatever helps you sleep at night.
We'll try open with that in episode 47 then. Today, though, gang, we have had two interesting pieces of news drop for both camps. And when I say both camps, I mean the big dogs in the video game industry, being Sony and Microsoft. Two pieces of information or news that I believe will directly impact the next generation of consoles. But those two pieces of news, for Sony at least, is remastering. A patent was actually filed in the US for basically remastering of terminology for remastering, and I think it was contained information about how these remasters might occur, which is very similar to how Xbox One X is handling their remasters. For Xbox, on the other hand, they've acquired two new studios. So we're going to touch on Microsoft's acquisition of studios, which is an increasing portfolio since E3. They've now acquired 7 studios. Sorry, they've acquired 6 and they've created a 7th studio in the last 6 months. So Microsoft is seemingly gearing up, guns blazing, for the next generation, or at least in the next few years in terms of first-party releases. But first, Mark, let's touch on Sony. What do you make of this remaster news or patent that's been filed? Now, keep in mind, take all of this with a pinch of salt. Nothing's been confirmed. This is just a patent for terminology that's gone through the US Patent Office.
For PlayStation, I always feel like they're 2 steps behind a lot of companies. Like they might bring out new tech and extraordinary games and things like that, but that's usually due to someone else dealing with them. But whenever they sort of come up with an idea, it's always like 2 steps behind. Like the PSP based off Game Boy sort of thing, and the PS Vita. Oh, they go, oh, the DS had a touchscreen. Let's put 2 touchscreens on this, because no one's ever going to think of using a back touchscreen. I wonder why.
Mark, it's actually funny that you bring up touchscreens as well, because I actually wasn't going to include this in this episode because I don't find it all that interesting, and I don't think a lot of people will either. But another patent was actually filed for PlayStation regarding a new touchscreen type controller as well.
Yeah. And like that's also why I brought that up, because I heard that too. Like, look, the PS4's got a touchpad button. Does anyone use it? No.
Sick. Yeah, exactly. Remember the light bar as well.
Yeah. See, that's the thing. Sony come up with these ideas a little too late and don't support. Backwards compatibility is a fantastic. It's a standard and a fantastic idea, but has been absent from Sony, or lacking from Sony for the last 2 generations. Like the PlayStation 3 was only backwards compatible with PlayStation 2 if you had the early consoles that had factory issues. Then it became only PS1 backwards compatible, which was really weird. Then the PS4 just ditched that entirely, and you had to just re-download games. And if you've got the Australian PlayStation Store, you know that you basically have access to almost no games. And it's just really frustrating. Because I'm someone who hangs on to my consoles specifically because I don't trust Sony to make backwards compatibility anymore. And meanwhile, you look over at a company like Nintendo and see the upcoming Smash Brothers. The GameCube controller still works on it. That's several generations of the same controller working for the same franchise.
See, it's interesting with Nintendo, isn't it? And I don't want to get too off topic here or track. Yeah. It's interesting with Nintendo because they're really good at supporting hardware, but in terms of software, it's a get fucked.
Yeah.
At least on the Switch.
Yeah, because they're like, we're going to cartridges. Yeah, can't do discs anymore.
No worries, don't worry. Remember that GameCube controller? Plug that in, don't worry about it.
Yeah. Forget about it.
It is interesting with Sony though, isn't it? Because it does feel like a lot of catch up. We've got the crossplay that they're seemingly hesitantly playing a little bit of catch up on now, or in their terms, they're listening, which probably means fuck all. Remastering though, backwards compatibility or supporting previous generation catalogs, it's something that's been a staple for Microsoft almost since day one. Since the 360 came along, they started supporting Xbox One games. Xbox One dropped, they started supporting 360 games, and now they're even supporting Xbox, I'm not going to say Xbox One, the original, the OG games now as well. Seemingly as well, it's only going to get easier and easier for them as they start to bring consistency to their platforms going forward, which they've been doing. The Xbox One X is very similar architecture, it's PC architecture, so games going forward are going to be easier to support. So it's been a given, it's been a bit of a love letter to gamers, and they've made it a staple almost for the industry. And I feel like you said, Sony is really just following suit and playing catch up, because let's face it, the PS5 is going to be x86 architecture. If they don't support backwards compatibility between PS4 at the very minimum, they're going to cop a lot of flack. And I think this remastering technique, which is quite interesting, by the way. I actually hadn't read up exactly how Microsoft may have been doing it, but at least from what I can read regarding this technology, they actually take assets from the game and they have artists remaster textures in 4K, right? Then when you install a disc, or you take the original disc and you pop it into your machine, it downloads some of these new assets, and it doesn't actually change any of the game code. So whenever, for example, a game will request from your console or needs a texture, instead of the original texture popping in, this new emulation or code flies in and drops the remaster asset or texture in instead. So it's pretty cool how they're doing it. I really like it. The fact that it's all happening through emulation rather than a true remaster process. But in regards to that, yeah, you're right. Sony is always seemingly just playing catch up, which is a shame. Yeah. But hopefully, at the very least, this opens the door for bringing previous generation catalogs to the PS5. Maybe PS3, maybe PS2, in better looking versions as well, much like we're getting with the Xbox One X enhancement versions. Yeah,
I really hope that it is sort of like the truest sense of backwards compatibility, that the old discs will work.
Yeah.
Although it might be a bit sad, because I don't know how many people held on to their PS2 for stuff like that. But like PS3, I think definitely needs, and PS4. If they don't, they're idiots, because if you release, say, The Last of Us again remastered, I think there's going to be a bit of a riot.
Yeah,
because I think it was within a year the PS4 had the remastered version.
Yeah, it was nuts, man. I mean, how can they not though? I mean, say what you want, pretend it's not. The Xbox One X is a next generation console that's just considered to be existing within this generation, because Microsoft wants to blur the lines there, right?
Yeah, Microsoft has been. Yeah.
It's like fucking 6 times more powerful than the original Xbox. It is a next gen console, yet all games are, without skipping a beat, backwards and forwards compatible. There's no differences between the games, bar better graphics and fidelity between. It's the same disc though. That's what I'm getting at. So how can the PS5 not support, at the very least, PlayStation 4 games? And then in my imagination, this software is probably more in place, or remastering emulation techniques probably is more in place to service PS3 or PS2 games, because the PS4 stuff should run, you would imagine, with relative ease on the next console.
But see, like I've always, backwards compatibility has always been such a strange thing, especially when talking about Xbox, because Xbox is the console family that I never expected to do it, but does it anyway, because Xbox One used Blu-rays, and before that it was DVDs. And I was just like, that like I can understand why your new console wouldn't, but your new console is, and the PlayStation 4 uses Blu-rays, the PlayStation 3 uses Blu-rays.
Yeah.
But never did anything about it.
To kind of dovetail into our Microsoft news though, are you worried about the PlayStation moving forward into the next generation? Because when you look at when the PlayStation 4 launched, it had a successful launch because it was no frills and it was just pitching a basic idea of just games. Yes, Microsoft came out the door. They misfired on all these cool, fancy, crazy, some cool, some bad DRM. They misfired on a lot of stuff that was still interesting, but the world perhaps wasn't ready for it.
Yeah, they wanted to take risks, but it was too many.
Exactly, and some of it was bad, some of it was good, but they were trying to do interesting, creative things to get in front of the pack. And then you had PlayStation, who still kind of, when it launched, was preaching, it's just games, just put the disc in, no frills. And it's seemingly they've kind of kept that same story tracking all the way through this generation. Like, they've been reluctant to get on board with crossplay. They don't want anything to rock their boat. They're still just about the games. So are you concerned about the PlayStation next generation? Because they're seemingly just always playing catch up. When you have somebody like Microsoft, who has been playing out, again, they have been playing catch up as well this generation in terms of sales. But they're making these big moves, like blurring the lines between generations, offering hardware options, been very proactive with backwards compatibility and crossplay. And now they're doubling down on studios. So when you look at that, are you concerned about the PlayStation next generation?
In terms of game development, I'm not, just because they've always had a pretty steady base for exclusives. But in terms of hardware and things like that, Sony have very rarely innovated.
Yeah.
Like I mentioned earlier, like the Vita and things like that. All of that is based off of someone else's idea, and they sort of tried to take it somewhere else. Like you look at the PlayStation Move, that was just a really weird Wii remote.
Yeah.
I always say it to a lot of people that probably the biggest innovation they ever had, and were the only ones to do it at the time, was the iToy on the PlayStation 2, because that was just like, oh my goodness, we've never thought of this before, and that was the only place you could get it. Whereas like Microsoft evolved it with the Kinect and things like that, and that went its other direction. And things like that. That was pretty much the only time I remember Sony directly innovating through hardware. And now you see this patent for a controller with a touchscreen. I'm like, Sony, that doesn't excite me.
No, not at all.
Yeah, and like I trust that they can make a good console, but it's not going to be a surprising console.
That's my concern as well, because seemingly it's been the same consistent story, a reluctancy to leave what is tried and true, which is just console and just games. And Microsoft, while yes, at the beginning of this generation, misfired and took risks that were wrong, they're now seemingly innovating and taking risks that are very, very right. And they're gearing up for the next generation. Let's talk about it now, Mark. They're gearing up for next generation with a large portfolio, or at least a new portfolio to add into the fold, of first-party developers that they've recently acquired. So just to sum it up for you guys, I've compiled us a little quick list. At E3 this year, they bought Undead Labs. Undead Labs created State of Decay and State of Decay 2. They acquired Playground Games. They're the creators of the Forza Horizon series. They acquired Ninja Theory. They created a pretty impressive portfolio: Hellblade, Devil May Cry, Enslaved Odyssey to the West, and Heavenly Sword. They acquired Compulsion Games, most recently released We Happy Few. These were all announced just at E3. So that's an impressive portfolio alone to roll into their existing portfolio of first-party developers. Most recently, though, this week, they acquired Obsidian Games. They're impressive. You should recognize that name because they created Fallout New Vegas, Knights of the Old Republic 2, and Pillars of Eternity, just to name a few. They also acquired, I think it's Inxile. I'm not sure.
I've been calling it In Exile.
In Exile, I think that's how it's meant to be pronounced. Yeah. I'm actually not that familiar with this developer, but they're the creators of Fantastic Contraption series, Torment, Tides of Numenera.
Yeah,
that's how you pronounce it.
Yeah, so Torment, for anyone who doesn't know, is the spiritual successor to Planescape Torment, which was sort of like the game that popularized that whole Baldur's Gate D&D top-down isometric. Yeah.
Okay. And finally, to round out our list, In Exile were the creators of Wasteland 2. So that's an impressive, some impressive acquisitions by Microsoft. And all of these developers will now be creating to the best of my knowledge, and you would assume exclusively for the Xbox platform. So there's some heavy hitters in there, Mark. So, I mean, Microsoft, in comparison, seem to be putting their money where their mouth is, acquiring the studios, filling that large void of first-party games that was lacking from the previous generation. Roll that in with all the interesting stuff they're doing with Game Pass, hardware, backwards compatibility. They're seemingly gearing up for a very successful next 10 years, or 5 to 10 years. But what do you make of these acquisitions, Mark?
I think it's good that they're sort of doing this because it's sort of future-proofing their IPs to a certain degree. Because I think I've said it in different podcasts before, where I miss when exclusive meant exclusive.
Yep.
For things like that, like Sony still have a few exclusives, and especially this year they've sort of proven that again. But Nintendo's always been that sort of thing where you know what you're getting from this console, and you know that that's the only place you can get this stuff.
Yep.
And like we said last week, that Nintendo's starting to change that image with a pretty decent setup of third-party support, but it still needs the stronger tech.
Yep.
But Microsoft's always sort of like, it's had strong IPs, but it hasn't had a consistent period where their exclusives can sort of sustain them. Like the last, I'm talking more like the last couple of years, where like the Halo game we got was Halo Wars.
Yep.
And no one really talked about it. And we didn't get like a new Gears of War and things like that. It was just sort of a dry exclusive period. And I'm hoping that sort of like acquiring these big IPs will at the very least make them exclusive to Microsoft. Or just the Xbox family of consoles. And make people want to tackle that console again and want to play that console again, because that's the only way you can experience Obsidian's next big crazy RPG experience, or the next Forza and things like that.
I mean, not to mention the financial support that these developers will probably receive from Microsoft as well. Like, I'm going to assume Microsoft wants all of these developers to be heavy hitters. They wouldn't just lightly acquire them and just, all right, go off and make whatever you want and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, like this acquisition alone would have probably cost them a lot. Like, they would have said, look, we want this, we're going to give you this much so you only make our stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, like, regarding their existing IPs as well, being, you know, Halo, the Forza series, yes, they did acquire the Forza developer, Gears of War. A lot of these series are getting a little bit long in the tooth. Still good in their own right, but not drawing in new numbers. So this is exactly what Microsoft needed to do, in my opinion. They've done everything else. They're being exciting, they're being innovative, the hardware's exciting, they're doing everything right, but you know, you're not going to invest in that ecosystem unless you have those experiences, which they didn't quite have in comparison to Sony. So this to me is music to my ears, because it is going to fill that void.
Like say, from this, they sort of continue Gears or whatever, things like that. But they might say create another 5 strong, consistent IPs.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look at the PlayStation 4. How many big releases do they actually get each year? At best, probably 2, right? Yeah. So this year we had God of War and we had Spider-Man. The year before
and they were
that,
pretty close to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the year before that was Uncharted 4?
No, it was Horizon Zero Dawn last
year. And the year before that was Uncharted 4.
Yeah.
So, you know, it doesn't take a lot of console exclusivity when, you know, you're already doing all the other cross-platform games, you know, well. I mean, in terms of performance, right? It doesn't take a lot. It takes 1 to 2 big heavy hitters each year to move your system. Which, again, Microsoft hasn't quite had, because we know Halo, Gears, Forza, you've already gobbled up the audience for those franchises. You need new, big, heavy hitters. And if Microsoft can still maintain and still service the existing fan base with those games, but bring in new investors and buyers into their ecosystem with all these new developers, then it's nothing but good news. And, you know, with a pedigree of developers like this, and this is assuming that they're not even going to buy more in the future, which I could absolutely see them doing if they're serious about, you know, building a first-party portfolio again, which they seemingly are. With this alone, they could seemingly put out or exceed what Sony is outputting on a yearly basis. Maybe not in the same caliber from the get-go in terms of a God of War or an Uncharted 4 or a Horizon Zero Dawn. But, you know, over a 5 to 10 year cycle, if they really invest in these studios and build quality over time, then absolutely, they could exceed Sony's output, which is should be music to any Xbox investor's ears.
Yeah, well, it's like, say if they say it's a 5-year-ish plan that they've got out. Say for their next sort of big venture at, say, E3, it'll be more details about it's Halo Infinite, was it? Is that the title?
Yep, Halo Infinite, yep.
So they might do new things about Halo Infinite, and then that gets everyone interested. Meanwhile, they're developing their next big IPs within that period, and when Halo sort of dwindles, then the next games come out.
Absolutely.
And blow everyone away while they develop all these things. So you have a cycle of IPs coming and going constantly, pretty much what the Nintendo formula's been this whole time, where they use Mario and Zelda and Star Fox and Metroid to elongate the sort of period between the next one.
And this is only what's visible as well. I mean, we can assume that Microsoft has their existing pedigrees working on new stuff. Well, we know they are. We know they have existing first-party studios working on stuff outside of the staples being Halo, Gears, and Forza. Yeah. And these guys that they've acquired could already have stuff in development as well that was acquired along with the developer. So as much as that may not be the big heavy hitters that are going to sink or take the fight to the Sony first-party heavy hitters, I think we can definitely expect that in probably 2 to 3 years' time. So it's interesting. It's interesting when you compare, I guess, it's horrible terminology, but the fighting grounds for the next generation between the two systems. In my opinion, to kind of sum up everything regarding what we've covered today and my thoughts on the next generation, whenever that happens, whatever it looks like. We know for the PlayStation it's going to be PS5, but whatever that looks like for the Xbox, we're not sure yet. I think Microsoft is going to have a very, very strong presence if they continue to try and innovate and now put the games at the forefront. Yeah.
Because so far it's all been hardware. Now it's time to focus.
Services.
On, So I think they've, not necessarily like they've been twiddling their thumbs, but it seems like they haven't been pumping out new exclusives or IPs, even though they've been working on in the background. I think it's now like the next E3 will be one of those ones where they want to do a showstopper.
Yeah,
sort of thing. It's like,
well, crap. I mean, next E3 we're going to get the Halo Infinite reveal. There'll be a full reveal regarding that. Yeah. And I think that'll probably be their big heavy hitter. Gears of War, guarantee that'll be next year as well. E3, I'd imagine. It's been, we had the announcement trailer for both Halo and Gears. So Gears of War and Halo will be, I think, next year's heavy hitters, which again are those existing staples that are, they're just present servicing the existing fan base, which is good. But I think probably the year after, I think we're going to start hearing stuff from these most recent acquisitions. So, Mark, to wrap up this video, how do you see next generation with Microsoft and Sony? Sony, be wary. What do you think it's going to play out as?
I think it's one of those things where it's like Sony needs to innovate and doesn't really know how, at least from what we can see. Which is the problem. Like, the developers know how to innovate, but Sony itself does not. Which is the issue. Microsoft's always had a strong base, regardless of its in or outside the console, because their PC zone has always been top notch.
Yep.
But now they're understanding the whole thing a lot better and know that these acquisitions are going to be key to the next few years, because not only have they acquired them for their exclusives or their new IPs, it's that Sony aren't going to get those.
Yep.
That's what I saw. I saw like Obsidian. You're like, oh, well, if they ever handle another big budget RPG that's would work well on console, Sony's not going to get it.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I sort of read the situation.
And they've done some impressive stuff. So
yeah, their track record's just been getting higher and higher.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, my final thoughts on this are Sony needs to lift their games in all areas outside of their first party offerings.
Yeah.
Because seemingly this generation, Microsoft has been doing nothing but trying to improve the value proposition of their console through hardware and services, create options, which they've done. They've spent this entire generation building a more attractive series of options and services. And they've completely taken that away from Sony. And now all they need is the games, and they're seemingly going to be delivering on that in the next probably, a few within the next 5 years, and even more past that 5-year mark. And I don't think, I mean, as much as these games are important and first-party offerings are important, I think that in combination with what they're already doing with all their services and hardware, it's going to create a very hard position for Sony to reach with the PS5. Because they are seemingly, like we said, playing a lot of catch-up in a lot of areas that Microsoft has just brought to the table and kind of, driven home as staples for the industry and like what it is to own a console. They just have all these offerings that we just take as a given now, that Sony now are being forced to offer.
So, I've been repeating myself a lot. It's just like Sony just needs to come up with something. Needs to just throw out some random idea and see if it works. It just starts figuring things out. Just don't watch what the trend is. Create a trend.
That's very true.
And it's just the most annoying thing because they're just consistently stuck in their ways.
Well, I think that's the most dangerous thing, isn't it? Is being a follower, not a leader.
Yeah.
Whereas Microsoft, even at the start of this generation, were trying to be a leader, misfired on a lot of stuff, but they went back to the drawing board, and now they're taking risks and innovations that are paying off. That's the difference. That's what Sony needs to at least attempt.
Yeah. And whenever you talk about console wars and things like that, it's usually just Sony and Nintendo because their sort of architecture or console setup were always very similar. Then so around towards the end of the Xbox 360 era, it started to divide a lot more because Microsoft were using their Kinect and things like that, and you were starting to see a distinct change in how they presented themselves and how innovation works. But I've always liked it how Nintendo always sort of sits outside of that. They're like, we're just going to do our thing.
Well, they're just pure innovation, right? Yeah. Or at least they attempt to be, which, again, it has its risks and rewards, and we see that evident in the Wii U.
Yeah,
but paying off with the Wii.
Yeah, the Wii U, they took a risk. It didn't work. That idea became the Switch. And you're like,
exactly.
Good. Yeah. And that's what I've always appreciated about them. And I like it when you're talking about Microsoft saying they need to this is their time to focus on first party, whereas parallel to Nintendo, this is their time to focus on third party.
Yeah, exactly it. So I mean, to kind of sum it all up, each, both Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft, they all have their weaknesses. But it just feels like Sony is much closer to delivering a far more and complete package next generation than what PS4 is or Sony is at the moment.
Yeah, I think of it like this, where you can imagine what the PS5 is going to be. You can't completely grasp whatever the next thing from Microsoft and Nintendo will be.
Exactly. Yeah. Get with the game, I think, Sony. Let's wrap it up though, Mark. So listeners, let us know what you think down below on everything we've covered in this large and expansive episode. What do you see next generation? Or what do you see playing out next generation between Sony and Microsoft? Who do you think will reign supreme next gen? As always, guys, if you have enjoyed this episode though, please remember to rate, comment, and subscribe. If you're listening to us on any of the popular podcasting services such as SoundCloud and iTunes, be sure to come out if you wish. Be sure to come on over and check out our YouTube channel where we cover a variety of other content in the form of news and reviews that don't make it to those platforms. Until next episode though, guys, have a good one.